Welcome again to another edition of Scherable. I'm your host, Bill Scher, and I apologize that I haven't had a lot of shareables over the Thanksgiving holiday and thereafter. If you haven't seen already, it's because I've been launching a new history podcast called When America Worked. I was spending a lot of that time putting the finishing touches on it, getting it posted and pushing it out into the world. And I want to take a little opportunity here, just talk about why I'm doing it and how it came to be. The initial subject is a person who almost nobody knows about, Edward R. Stettinius Jr. And I credit him with having the greatest role in the creation of the United Nations, which I also credit for actually producing a lot of good for the world, massive reduction in war-related casualties, and a catalyst for the end of decolonization. All controversial points. And it might seem like a poor marketing choice to pick a subject who nobody knows about to kick off a new podcast, because you look in the subject head, you see a person's name you never heard of before. You're not automatically excited about hearing more about that story. But as I say in the podcast, the main reason for focusing on him or starting with him is that I think he represents the biggest gulf between most good done for the world and least amount of recognition in his time and afterwards. But it's also an important story for me and just my own interest in history and pragmatism. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. I wrote a piece several years ago now, I think 8 years ago, called How Liberals Win, and it got in the New York Times, and it was about Obamacare and how Obama's negotiation and compromise with corporate interests were the linchpin to getting that bill passed. And that is fairly antithetical to a lot of progressive thought, which is that corporate influence is is not just an obstacle, but the obstacle, and therefore needs to be fought bitterly and completely, because compromising with such interests is a fool's game. Having been, I wasn't in the White House or in Congress at that time, but I was working for a group that was doing a lot of activism around the subject, so I was keeping a close eye on things. And so I had a pretty good sense of why I thought the bill passed and why Hillary Care and other attempts at healthcare reform did not pass. And that corporate piece I thought was critical. I did and as I thought about making that into an op-ed, I thought, well, I better do a lot of research about why is this different than the Clinton experience or the LBJ experience or the FDR experience. And digging into the Great Society and the New Deal, it's when I discovered there was a lot more bargaining with corporations than is widely known, and those stories are not often told. So I got into that for that op-ed, and just my appetite was whetted. What else don't I know? And I think it was around the same time that I'm here in Northampton, Massachusetts, home of Calvin Coolidge, and I had sort of an interest in how did the Republican Party shift from being a Teddy Roosevelt party to a Ronald Reagan party, and where does Calvin Coolidge fit in all that? And so I was interested in reading about the presidential biographies, before and after him. And in doing that, I started going in succession. And after, doing before Coolidge, after Coolidge with FDR, again to Truman. And I learned that the first decision Truman had to make when FDR dies and Truman ascends to the presidency, the very first thing he has to do that night is decide whether or not the conference for the United Nations should go forward. It was scheduled for later that month of April 1945. Truman was not an insider in the Roosevelt White House. He'd only been VP for a month. He wasn't in all the meetings. He wasn't a close confidant. And, how could anybody know how he felt about these things? And so it was an uncertainty what he would do when Stettinius is who asks him, are you going to do this? And he was suggesting that he should do it. They should keep it on schedule. And Truman does. And, Truman was a fan of Woodrow Wilson and Wilson's League of Nations. Truman was a student of history and very much did want the United Nations to come into being. So that just piqued a whole new interest of mine, which was, well, how did this happen? How the United Nations happened? And when I picked up a book about the creation of the United Nations, and I learned that there was a whole bunch of spying that went on by the precursor to the NSA, which Stettinius, then Secretary of State, running the San Francisco conference, he was consuming all this surveillance about America's allies to try to navigate disputes that were holding up a final charter. I'm learning about this during the time of the Snowden leaks, and Glenn Greenwald, who was an ally of Snowden's, was arguing that Obama's surveillance of Germany and of other allies within the UN surrounding a resolution to admonish Iran's nuclear program, that these are examples of malevolence. And so I'm reading about the UN's creation and the spying that went on. And you may have a moral objection to surveillance, which I understand, but it was pretty clear when you read the story about the UN that it wasn't done with bad intent. It was done to try to get to an agreement. It wasn't to kneecap different countries. It was to learn about what their problems were so they could be resolved without things getting out of hand. So it just opened up a world to me about why does surveillance happen? Why does peacetime surveillance happen? Why does diplomatic surveillance happen? And I actually wrote that piece up, I think it was 2014, I wasn't it wasn't solicited. It was an unsolicited submission to Politico. It was the first thing I ever pitched to Politico, which they took, and that's what began my relationship with them. And so when I decided more recently, first I should say, after Trump was elected, I was thinking about trying to write another book, and I came upon an idea to write a book about great achievements in American history forged by pragmatism. The UN story loomed very large in my mind, and so I put together a book proposal. I tried very hard to get that book sold. I got a little close, but it didn't happen. And then I decided, I did all this work on the book proposal. I had a sample chapter about Stettinius, and I had a bunch of other sketches for about a dozen or so other chapters. I said, this would make a perfectly fine podcast series, if not one that it's going to take a lot of work, because it's essentially like writing a book, each chapter being a podcast episode. But that whole, and delving into that, trying to dig up other examples of pragmatic achievements, it just continues to feed my notion of, what's out there, what stories have not been told that are really relevant and are really educational as far as learning and appreciating how things get done. These are stories that don't get shared, in my opinion. One, they might not get shared because they're a little dry sometimes. They're not necessarily full of exciting twists and turns, though I do think the one about the UN has a lot of exciting twists and turns and has a lot of intrigue. But no political ideological side has much interest in pushing it. The folks on the left have great interest in pushing stories that involve grassroots organizing. But the insider wheeling and dealing and the compromising, that doesn't have the same organic base of support. Another thing about the Stettinius story that I think is also very relevant is that you see there's a ton of palace intrigue in the story. There's this whole episode between the Secretary of State and the Undersecretary of State at war with each other over who gets to control the UN portfolio. One of them gets shivved. There's a sex scandal involved with that. And then after he gets shivved, that's when Stettinius comes on, even though Stettinius is not much of a diplomat. And then because of other palace intrigue, the Secretary of State resigns, and that elevates Stettinius and puts him in this very powerful position that many people think he's not well suited for. And when you read about this type of bureaucratic infighting, and I should also add, there's the other episode that I get into the very, very end of the podcast, where Stettinius essentially wants to do something that the rest of the State Department doesn't want to do, by and large, and so he keeps them in the dark. He doesn't. There's no personal papers about it, and there's a total end run around his own department to do a back channel diplomacy with the Argentinian strongman Juan Perón. So there's all this backbiting and bureaucratic infighting that went on, and it's something to keep in mind when you read about it in modern presidencies. Trump's palace intrigue is a whole other level, of course. But every presidential administration has a degree of infighting, has disagreements, policy-based, turf-based, ego-based, personality-based, combinations thereof. And every time it happens, it's written about in very breathy tones as if it's never happened before, but it always happens. And so it's not interesting that it happens. What's interesting is how is it going to affect policy? And that can be hard to discern from the outside. I mean, all these things that went on between Cordell Hull and Sumner Welles and Stettinius and Nelson Rockefeller and so on and so forth, they'd be hard to make sense of it all from the outside as it was happening. But it is good that there is contemporaneous reporting of these things to help you piece it all together once a presidency is done. And so I suggest you, when listening to it, keep that in mind. I'd keep in mind, what does it take to bridge differences between different nations? And what does it take to bridge differences within an administration? What does it take to bridge differences between two parties? Because there's a bit of that in the story too. I was not a big history buff 10 years ago. I had a Philistine view that history was kind of musty, didn't have a lot of current relevance. And the more and more I read about it, the more and more I see where there's enormous relevance and enormous application to our current plights and crises. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to it, please, I have a new website where it will be housed, Scherable.com. You can go to Scherable.com/WhenAmericaWorked. It's on most podcast platforms now, including iTunes and Spotify and Stitcher. And maybe after we can get a whole bunch of folks to listen to it, we can do one of these. We can do a live chat about the episode, take people's questions. And maybe even that kind of session, maybe even doing a live chat around it could even be its own standalone bonus podcast. So thanks again for listening to Scherable. If you like, please subscribe. Please support on Patreon at patreon.com/BillShare. And this also goes to the podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast. Please write a review about the podcast. Please share the podcast with a friend. All these things will help make it a more sustainable project. And I can keep telling these stories for the foreseeable future. So thanks again, everybody. Talk to you soon.